If I were in Beijing, I'd want China to be the dominant power by far in East Asia. I'd want to be a regional hegemon, just as I, as an American, am happy that we're a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. The Chinese want to be able to roam all around the globe with their military forces, just like the United States roams all around the globe. Why? Because that's the best way to protect your economic and political interests. What's very important to understand that in 1994, the Clinton administration decided that it was going to expand NATO eastward, and that the United States and its allies would have an open door policy. That meant that they would allow any country that wanted to come into NATO to join NATO. And the first group of countries that entered NATO from Eastern Europe were Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, and they all entered in 1999. Then in 2004, another group of countries entered NATO, and this included the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, Slovakia. And then, very importantly, in 2008, NATO said that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO. And the Russians then said that this was unacceptable, that Ukraine joining NATO was an existential threat. But the problem from the West's point of view was that they had an open door policy regarding NATO expansion. And the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, felt that if Ukraine wanted to become part of NATO, it could become part of NATO, no matter what the Russians said. But of course, the Russians said, this is not going to happen. So a crisis broke out in February 2014. That's the beginning of the crisis between the West and Ukraine on one side and Russia on the other side. Now, the question you want to ask yourself is, what did the United States do when that crisis broke out in February 2014? Did it back off and say we have to respect Russia's interests? No, it did not do that. The United States thought that it could shove NATO expansion into Ukraine down Russia's throat. And of course, what happened in February 2022, this is 8 years after the crisis broke out, you got a major war, that war that is now taking place. The question you want to ask yourself is, what did the United States do once the war broke out? Again, it doubled down. It increased its commitment to bringing Ukraine into NATO. So what's going on here is that the United States is deeply committed, as is NATO more generally, to bringing Ukraine into NATO. And it is willing to do everything it can to help Ukraine defeat Russia on the battlefield. And this explains, I believe, why the United States has gotten more deeply involved since 2014, when the crisis broke out, and shows no signs of walking away from the war in Ukraine. Again, you do not want to lose sight of how deeply committed the United States and its European allies are to an open door policy regarding NATO expansion. They really believe that any country that wants to become part of NATO has a right to do so, and it doesn't matter what the Russians think. And they remain firmly committed to that belief. And they have little interest, the West has little interest in seeing a neutral Ukraine. If you want to ask how to solve this crisis, it's actually quite simple. Well, one is to make sure that Ukraine does not become part of NATO, and two, that it is a neutral state. And that would go a long way towards solving this crisis. But the United States at this point in time has no interest in a neutral Ukraine. It wants to see Ukraine in NATO. I think the Ukrainian invasion into the Kursk area of Russia was a major mistake. And it was a major mistake because it's not going to improve Ukraine's position in the war, its position on the battlefield. I believe that the Ukrainians thought that if they invaded the Kursk region, that they would cause the Russian military all sorts of problems. And this would shift the momentum in the war away from Russia and toward Ukraine. This was a foolish idea because if anything, what invading the Kursk region did was to accelerate Ukrainian losses in eastern Ukraine, which is the main battlefield in this war. So the Ukrainians who were doing poorly in eastern Ukraine before the Kursk offensive, their Kursk offensive, are now doing worse. And the reason is that the Ukrainians had to take forces away from the battlefields in eastern Ukraine, these critically important battlefields, and deploy them as part of the Kursk offensive. In fact, because the Ukrainians are on the offensive in the Kursk region, that means they're out in the open and they're moving forward. And that allows Russian aircraft and Russian drones to destroy those Ukrainian forces more easily than if they were on the defensive. So this was a major mistake on the part of Ukraine, but I would say it's highly unlikely. If NATO were to send ground forces and air forces into Ukraine, and those forces were fighting against the Russians, you would then have a great power war. In Europe, you would have the United States, which is, of course, a great power, fighting against Russia, which is a great power. And this would be a war between two great powers that are armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. And furthermore, that war would be taking place on Russia's doorstep. And Russia already views the war in Ukraine as an existential threat. If the Americans and their European allies were involved, this would be an existential threat on steroids. It would be deeply worrying to the Russians, and it would be a scenario where they might very well use nuclear weapons to protect themselves. The United States, of course, recognizes this. The United States does not want a great power war with Russia, and it certainly does not want a war with Russia that has the potential to escalate to the nuclear level. So I think it is extremely unlikely that we, meaning the Americans, would get involved in the fighting in Ukraine if Ukraine continues to lose, which I think is going to happen. This is not to deny that the Americans will be tempted to intervene and that the Europeans, especially the East Europeans, will be tempted to intervene. But I think cooler heads will prevail, and NATO will not intervene in the fighting in Ukraine. I think at this point in time, it's almost impossible to see how the United States can back off in a meaningful way from the war in Ukraine. I think the United States may reduce its commitment to Ukraine somewhat. I think that's especially true if Donald Trump gets elected in November. But I believe that the United States will remain committed to Ukraine for the foreseeable future. If Harris wins the election, she will basically continue Biden's policy, which is to do everything possible to support the Ukrainians. There'll be little change in her policy. And as you know, Donald Trump makes the argument that if he is elected president in November, that he will end the war in Ukraine very quickly. And he basically says that he will end that war even before he moves into the White House. I certainly don't believe that's going to happen, and I don't believe he will do anything of any consequence to end the war once he does enter the White House. I think that this war will end when Ukraine is defeated on the battlefield and understands that it makes no sense to continue fighting. I don't believe you're going to get a meaningful peace agreement, but I do think you'll get a frozen conflict at some point, simply because the Ukrainians will no longer be capable of carrying on the battle. They're just suffering so greatly now, and they're losing territory, and they're losing huge numbers of soldiers at a rapid pace. They just can't continue, in my opinion, much beyond 2025. So I think this war will end either late this year or early next year and turn into a frozen conflict. Well, Ukraine will be a dysfunctional rump state. It will have lost a large chunk of territory. How much territory it will ultimately lose is hard to say at this point in time, but there's no question Ukraine's going to lose a lot of its territory, and that the Russians are going to have a deep-seated interest in making sure that Ukraine is economically weak and politically dysfunctional. So this is a disaster for Ukraine. Now, the question you want to ask yourself is, what will Ukraine do after you get this frozen conflict? What will the West do after you get this frozen conflict? And my view is that both Ukraine and the West will go to great lengths to undermine Russia, and especially to undermine its position inside those areas of Ukraine that Russia has annexed. So this conflict, the conflict is not going to end. The war, I think, will end, and it will turn into a frozen conflict. But in the context of that frozen conflict, the Russians will go to great lengths to keep Ukraine as a dysfunctional rump state. The Russians will go to great lengths to sow dissension inside of Europe, and that includes both NATO and the European Union. The Russians will go to great lengths to sow dissension between the United States and its European allies. And at the same time, the West and the Ukrainians will go to great lengths to cause trouble for Russia. So once we get a frozen conflict, that does not mean you're going to have something approximating peace as a result of all that's happened. In fact, what you're going to get is trouble for as far as the eye can see. One does not want to underestimate the consequences, the serious consequences, the disastrous consequences of the 2008 NATO decision to bring Ukraine into the alliance. That was a huge mistake. It has had catastrophic consequences so far, and it will have more catastrophic consequences moving forward. But from an American point of view, Ukraine has been a disaster for a variety of reasons. But one of the main reasons is that it has pushed the Russians closer to China. And the Russians and the Chinese now have a vested interest in cooperating to thwart the United States all around the globe. Both China and Russia see the United States as an adversary, and they both understand that it's in their mutual interest to work together to check the United States, to cause trouble for the United States. In an ideal world, the United States would have close relations with Russia. It would be allied with Russia against China. And the United States, in an ideal world, would do everything it could to exploit differences between China and Russia and get Russia to be close to the United States and basically an adversary of China. But the exact opposite has happened in large part because of the Ukraine war. So you now have this close relationship between Russia and China. All of this is to say that from China's point of view, the war in Russia is manna from heaven. It's really good news. The Chinese have a vested interest in seeing the war or the conflict between the West on one side and Russia on the other side continue for the foreseeable future because it will ensure that Russia and China have good relations. And that's obviously in China's national interest, but it's not in America's national interest. There are a number of people in the West who argue that Russia is becoming a vassal state of China, that the Chinese are basically moving into a world where they can dictate Russian policy in all sorts of ways. I think this argument is wrong. I think the Russians will do what's in their national interest. And the Russians are a great power. And as a great power, Russia has lots of flexibility in terms of which policies it pursues or doesn't pursue. But I think there's no question that the Russians are going to seek help, seek assistance from China, and I think China's going to give Russia lots of assistance. China has a vested interest in seeing Russia defeat the West and Ukraine in this conflict. It's in China's interest. So China will help Russia. And in terms of what happens in East Asia, Russia will go to great lengths to help China prevail against the United States in any conflict situation that arises, because it's in Russia's interest to do everything possible to defeat the United States all over the globe, not only in Ukraine. So these two countries are going to have close relations as long as the United States is an adversary of both countries. What's going on here is that the United States has a deep-seated interest in making sure that China does not incorporate Taiwan into its body politic. The United States, to put it bluntly, has a deep-seated interest in making sure that Taiwan remains independent of China, and it also remains an ally of the United States. The United States believes that Taiwan is an important strategic asset in its competition with China. So the United States has no intention of allowing China to absorb Taiwan. And at the same time, the Chinese, for strategic reasons and reasons related to nationalism, is deeply committed to incorporating Taiwan into the mainland. So the United States and China have opposing positions on the question of Taiwan. And the United States also has deep-seated differences with China over the South China Sea and over the East China Sea. The United States has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. It's China that wants to change the status quo. China wants to change the status quo vis-a-vis Taiwan, vis-a-vis the East China Sea, and vis-a-vis the South China Sea. And the United States, of course, likes the status quo and wants to keep the status quo. So it has no interest, in my opinion, in provoking China. The problem that the Americans do face is that the Americans have to take certain measures to deal with the fact that China is becoming an increasingly powerful country in East Asia. Because of China's truly impressive economic growth, it is translating much of that economic might into military might. And China is becoming an increasingly powerful military force in East Asia. I think there's no question that the Chinese have, over the past few years, been moving closer to Taiwan, flying into its airspace more regularly and putting great pressure on Taiwan. One could call it tightening the noose around Taiwan's neck. And the question you ask, of course, is what will the United States do? I think the United States will do everything possible to make sure that Taiwan remains independent of China, not formally independent, but maintains its de facto independence. And the United States will not allow China to strangle Taiwan in any meaningful way. The United States, as I say, is committed to defending Taiwan. The United States believes that it's very important that China not be able to swallow Taiwan or coerce Taiwan into surrendering. And given that China is not a status quo power, that it wants to change the status quo, and at the same time it's becoming militarily more powerful, there's no question that the United States is going to make certain moves to redress the balance as it shifts in China's favor. And those moves by the United States are, of course, going to upset the Chinese greatly. They're going to be seen as provocative. I fully understand that. But that's unavoidable. But that's different from Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan in a very provocative way and causing all sorts of tensions to come to the surface in terms of the U.S. China relationship. My view, to elevate this discussion a bit, is that I think the United States and China have a deep-seated interest in making sure that their differences over the South China Sea, Taiwan, and the East China Sea do not escalate into a war. I think it's very important from both the Chinese perspective and the American perspective that a war not break out between the two countries. And that means that both sides should go to great lengths to avoid provocative moves. And if a crisis breaks out, both sides should go to great lengths to dampen down the tensions and end the crisis as quickly as possible. Because as we all know, China's armed with nuclear weapons, the United States is armed with nuclear weapons, and the last thing we want is a conflict between those two countries to escalate into a hot war where there's a serious possibility that nuclear weapons are used. So I think provocative acts should be avoided as much as possible, but I would add the caveat that to some extent they're unavoidable because both sides are taking measures to improve their security position that the other side will invariably see as provocative. I don't think a hot war over Taiwan is likely in the near future, as long as Taiwan does not declare its independence. And by the way, the United States will go to great lengths to make sure that Taiwan does not formally declare its independence. So I don't think that it's likely to have a hot war over Taiwan anytime soon. Now, you may say to yourself, why is that the case? I think there are really two reasons for that. First, amphibious operations are among the most difficult military operations for any army to conduct. An amphibious operation across the Taiwan Straits would be remarkably difficult to execute for China. A lot of this has to do with the fact that China has not fought a war since 1979. It's very important to understand that. The Chinese military does not have much combat experience. So I think the Chinese recognize that and will not try to invade anytime soon. This gets to my second point, which will reinforce my first point. My second point has to do with the question, which is the one you asked, as to whether the United States would fight to defend Taiwan in the event that China tried to invade. I think that the United States would definitely come to the aid of Taiwan. I think there is no way that the United States would stand by and allow China to conquer Taiwan. And I believe that Chinese leaders understand this. I believe that Chinese leaders understand that if they try to invade Taiwan, they will not just face Taiwanese military forces, they will face the Americans, and I believe they will also face the Japanese and probably the Australians as well. The United States and its allies in East Asia have a deep-seated interest in making sure that China does not conquer Taiwan. So that's why I don't think, for the moment, we have to worry about a war over Taiwan. Again, we're involved in a strategic competition here. We're involved in a serious security competition. And neither China nor the United States has any intention of losing. They're both going to push hard to take advantage of the other side. And when that competition plays itself out over Taiwan, the potential for danger is great. I don't think political support matters at all. American foreign policy elites do what they want to do. They don't really care about public opinion. And if they think there's any problem with the public, they'll propagandize. They'll invent stories that convince the American public that fighting a war over Taiwan is absolutely necessary. Should a conflict break out over Taiwan, I would argue that it doesn't matter whether a Democrat's in power or a Republican's in power. The leadership would act the same regardless of party affiliation. I think there's no question that the Americans are in a weaker position to defend Taiwan because of the assets they're committing to the Middle East, and because of the assets they're committing to the Ukraine war. I think this is in China's interest. I think the Ukraine war, as I said before, but also all these wars in the Middle East and America's sort of deep-seated commitment to Israel works to China's advantage because it makes it difficult for the United States to fully pivot to Asia. But the fact is that we have substantial assets in East Asia, and President Biden has said on 4 separate occasions that the United States would defend Taiwan if it were invaded. Well, a couple points. One is you want to remember that Trump said after he was elected in 2016 that he was going to fundamentally change foreign policy around the world. You remember he said that he was going to have good relations with Russia, and he was going to have especially good relations with Vladimir Putin. And that did not happen. And it did not happen because Trump was up against powerful forces inside the United States that have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. I think Trump, when he was elected in 2016, was interested in challenging the deep state, but he lost and he moved back toward the standard Republican foreign policy positions. And I think that'll happen again if he's reelected this fall. So Trump is going to come into power and he's going to say that he's going to change X and Y and Z. He's going to implement a new policy here and there. He's going to end the Ukraine war. You know the rhetoric. But whether he does that is another matter. He didn't do it in his first term. And I don't think he's going to radically alter American foreign policy in his second term. Second point I would make to you is that the area of the world where he really wants to change foreign policy is in Europe. And it's with regard to the Ukraine war and with regard to Vladimir Putin. Trump is interested in having good relations with the Russians, especially with Putin. And he's interested in ending the Ukraine war. But he has not said that he's going to change America's policy in East Asia. And you want to remember that Trump is the president who in 2017 abandoned engagement policy and adopted containment policy. So Trump has a history of challenging China, treating China as an adversary. And there's no reason to think that if he's elected, he's going to change or even try to change America's policy in East Asia toward China. He may try to change American policy towards Russia over the Ukraine war, but he's not going to have any effect, or he's not going to try to have any effect or try to change U.S. policy toward China. So I don't think it matters much whether you have Trump or Harris in the White House. And I would just add to that, even if Trump said he was going to change U.S. policy in East Asia, I don't think he could do it at this point in time. I think the die is cast here. You're going to have a serious security competition between China and the United States for probably the rest of this century. Well, I actually think the conflict between China and the Philippines, which is taking place in the South China Sea, tells you that the South China Sea is a more dangerous flashpoint than Taiwan is. As I said before, I don't think it's likely that you'll have a war over Taiwan. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I don't think it's likely. I think it's more likely that you'll have a conflict in the South China Sea that involves both the United States and China. As you know, the United States is closely allied with the Philippines. And the United States has a formal treaty with the Philippines. And the United States has a deep-seated interest in making sure that China does not dominate the South China Sea. So I would argue that as this conflict between the Philippines and China escalates, it is likely that the United States will come in or form closer and closer relations with the Filipinos. And I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in the not too distant future, the United States commits itself to escorting Filipino ships in the South China Sea. And of course, this would lead to serious trouble with China, because China would not be happy at all if the United States was escorting Filipino ships. But I think, it is a likely scenario moving forward. I believe from China's point of view, it makes eminently good sense to try to push the Americans out of East Asia, push them back beyond the first island chain, and then push them back beyond the second island chain. If I were a policymaker in Beijing, that's what I would want to do. But you have to understand that from an American point of view, it's in your interest, it's in America's interest not to let that happen and to have freedom of navigation in the South China Sea and to limit Chinese military presence. And this is why the situation is so dangerous. And I think that given what's going on between the Filipinos and the Chinese involving the second Thomas Shoal is evidence that this flashpoint is more likely to lead to trouble between the United States and China than Taiwan is. I think if you talk about India, you have to talk about three different flashpoints. One is East Asia. Two is the Himalaya Mountains. This is the India-China border. And three is the Indian Ocean. And I think that India is of little strategic value in East Asia. I think if a conflict breaks out in East Asia, the Indian military is not going to be involved. So when we talk about the South China Sea, the East China Sea, Taiwan, or the Korean Peninsula, I think India is largely irrelevant for those contingencies. With regard to the India-China border, which is a seriously dangerous flashpoint, I don't think the United States is going to get involved there. I think that's basically a conflict that will involve the Chinese on one side and the Indians on the other side. So I think there's really no connection there, no meaningful connection between the United States and India. I find it hard to see them acting as allies, the United States and India acting as allies up in the Himalayas. That'll be China versus India. I think the Indian Ocean is a different matter. I think that what's happening here is that China is developing a blue water navy. It's in the early stages, but China is interested in developing meaningful power projection capability. I've long argued that what China is trying to do is imitate the United States. And what do I mean by that? First of all, China is trying to become a regional hegemon in East Asia, just like the United States is a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. And again, from China's point of view, this makes eminently good sense. If I were in Beijing, I'd want China to be the dominant power by far in East Asia. I'd want to be a regional hegemon, just as I, as an American, am happy that we're a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. So China's first goal, in my opinion, is to establish regional hegemony, if it can, in East Asia. Its second goal, and here again we're imitating the United States, is to develop a blue water navy and other military assets that give it significant power projection capability. The Chinese want to be able to roam all around the globe with their military forces, just like the United States roams all around the globe. Why? Because that's the best way to protect your economic and political interests. Now, let's get back to the Indian Ocean. As you know, China has to go through the Straits of Malacca and then into the Indian Ocean to get to the Persian Gulf. And China has a deep-seated interest in developing power projection capabilities that can cover the route from the eastern coast of China all the way to the Persian Gulf, because China gets lots of oil from the Persian Gulf. This means that China is going to develop a blue water navy that moves through the Indian Ocean. This scares the Indians greatly. It scares the Americans greatly. And it's in the Indian Ocean, in my opinion, where you're likely to see meaningful military cooperation between India and the United States. That's the flashpoint, the potential flashpoint, where the Indians and the Americans are likely to have a vested interest in working together to counter Chinese influence, or to counter the Chinese military, or to counter the power projection capability that China is in the process of developing. The Chinese strategy in the Middle East is very different than the American strategy. Let me talk first about the Americans. First of all, it's important to understand that the Americans have a long-standing involvement, a long-standing deep involvement in the Middle East. And during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union competed in the Middle East for a long period of time. Second point you want to remember about the Americans is that the United States has a special relationship with Israel that fundamentally affects its policies in the region. The United States is profoundly committed to supporting Israel. And this has a huge impact on America's policy across the entire region. I believe, for example, the main reason that the United States has terrible relations with Iran, and why there is no prospect of the United States improving its relations with Iran, is because Israel is so antagonistic towards Iran, and Israel goes to such great lengths to make sure that the United States and Iran remain bitter enemies. So what you see with regard to American policy is deep involvement in the region, deep involvement in the politics of every country in the region. But because of the special relationship the United States has with Israel, its relations with countries like Iran are poisoned. And its relations with countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Egypt are also badly strained by the fact that the United States supports Israel in its policies towards the Palestinians. That's the American side of the story. China is a relative newcomer to the Middle East. China is deeply interested in the Middle East because of the oil in the Persian Gulf. There's no question about that. There's no question that China has a strategic interest in the Persian Gulf, or to put it more generally, in the Middle East. So what we see, unsurprisingly, is that China is becoming more deeply involved in the Middle East. And what you see is that China is trying to develop close relations with Iran and with Saudi Arabia. And of course, it's also trying to have close relations with other Gulf states because it gets oil from those other Gulf states as well. And the Chinese, unsurprisingly, are taking advantage of the fact that the United States has terrible relations with Iran and has strained relations with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and Egypt and Turkey, all because of Israel. The fact is that the United States is deeply committed to Israel. It has a special relationship with Israel that has no parallel in recorded history. The United States gives Israel unconditional support. No matter what Israel does, the United States supports it. And the question is, why is this the case? And the answer is because of the power of the Israel lobby in the United States. The United States is a country which has a political system that allows interest groups to have huge influence on the policy process. There's no interest group that is anywhere near as powerful as the Israel lobby. And it has a profound effect on U.S. Middle East policy. And the Israel lobby, as you would expect, wants the United States to support Israel unreservedly. And we give Israel huge amounts of economic and military aid, as well as diplomatic aid. And we pursue policies in the region that are favorable to Israel. And as I said before, if you want to know why the United States and Iran have had terrible relations for so long and why there's no prospect of improving those relations, all you have to do is look at how Israel itself and the lobby, the Israel lobby, think about U.S.-Iranian relations. And it's quite clear both Israel and the lobby want to make sure that the United States continues to have poisonous relations with Iran. Well, I don't think there's anything the United States can do to change its policy towards Israel and towards the Middle East. The lobby is just too powerful. But the fact is that there's no difference between the Republicans and the Democrats on the question of Israel. Whether you have Kamala Harris or Donald Trump in the White House, both of them will support Israel to the hilt. It's just the way it works. So that's effectively how I see American foreign policy being made. So you see, in a very important way, America's remarkably close relationship with Israel works to China's advantage because it creates problems for the Americans that the Chinese can exploit. The United States has all of these naval assets now in the Middle East that should be deployed in East Asia, or at least most of them should be deployed in East Asia. But the United States is not deploying those assets in East Asia because they have to be in the Middle East to help Israel deal with threats from countries like Iran and from actors like Hezbollah and Hamas. And furthermore, right, it's creating opportunities for China to gain greater influence in the Middle East. This, again, is not in our interest. So in the Middle East, we're being hindered in our efforts to pivot to Asia, as we are in the Ukraine war. And furthermore, given our relationship with Israel, it's very difficult for us to have good relations with all of the countries in the region, which presents opportunities for China. So American foreign policy is, in my opinion, remarkably foolish these days.
What do you guys think? How is his geopolitics breakdown? Please leave your comment below. We would love to hear from you.
Thank you for making it this far. If you like this video, you might want to share it with a like-minded friend. Thank you, and as always, stay blessed.